Hi there. I am going to read Unit 5.16, Postmodernism, for this read along. So I've gone through the content there on the left and I've chosen 5.16. The introduction is usually just a paragraph or two, so I'm going to click the Explore button. And then I'm going to go into the printer version, so that puts it all on one page for me, so I can just scroll. Okay, so talking about postmodernist art. America in the 1960s. After having weathered the Great Depression and secured victory in Europe and the Pacific in World War II, most mainstream Americans just wanted to settle back into their normal lives in the 1950s. In the 1960s, however, world events and social pressures would generate momentous changes to the country's political and cultural landscape. So changes are common in the 60s. Hoping to halt the spread of communism, the United States sent troops to far-off Vietnam. But as years passed and casualties mounted, the war became increasingly unpopular. At home, other changes were brewing. African Americans demanded their civil rights, and the equality denied them for so long. Women began a movement to increase their political influence and end workplace discrimination. Many young people became disillusioned with their parents' social values, forming a counterculture that emphasized nonconformity. So the younger people growing up wanted to maybe challenge norms and question authority and things like that, unlike their parents did. The freedom to experiment and a spirit of anything goes. American society was in a state of flux, a situation reflected in the art of that area. So it being in a state of flux means that things were a little unstable as far as what they had been in the past. So we had our civil rights, the Vietnam War going on at this time. So postmodernist art. By the mid-1960s, it seemed that there were no boundaries left for modernist painters and sculptors to cross. All the rules and conventions of traditional art had already been rejected, ignored, or broken. Modernism was fast becoming old news. But art, like nature, doesn't like a vacuum. Some new style had to step in to replace modernism, and it came to be called, logically, if not imaginatively, postmodernism. So post means after. Because it encompasses a broad range of styles and includes references to art of the past, postmodernism is difficult to define as a movement. The range of formats is broad too, from easel painting to temporary installation pieces in public spaces. Postmodern artists often drew from mass culture for their inspiration. They sometimes incorporated images of popular contemporary icons in their work, so that could be celebrities, making it easily accessible and recognizable to everyone who experienced it. So what we see on the right here is a piece called Improvisation 31 by Kandinsky. And many people found paintings by artists such as Kandinsky and de Kooning difficult to understand and appreciate. So that's Kandinsky, and then there's de Kooning that we studied in the unit before. Robert Rauschenberg was born in Port Arthur, Texas in 1925. At age 22, he changed his name to Robert Rauschenberg because it sounded more artistic. So his first name is actually Milton, so he changed it to Robert. Rauschenberg suffered from dyslexia, a disorder that made it difficult for him to read and spell, and as a result, he faltered throughout his schooling. That means he had a hard time with school. While my classmates were reading their textbooks, I drew in the margins, he once said. Drafted into the U.S. Navy during World War II, Rauschenberg served in the Hospital Corps in San Diego. Drawing portraits in his spare time, when Rauschenberg was 19, it occurred to him that he could paint for a living. Determined to be an artist, he studied at the Kansas Art Institute and at the Académie Julian in Paris. So dyslexia is a condition that makes it difficult to read and to spell, so that led Rauschenberg to express himself in the world of visual art. An independent spirit. In 1948, Rauschenberg returned to the United States to study with abstract painter Joseph Albers at the Black Mountain College in North Carolina. He wanted to learn about Albers' strict, disciplined approach to composition. Rauschenberg said that Albers was the most important teacher in his life, partly because Albers inspired Rauschenberg to do the opposite of what Albers taught him. Unlike Albers' methodical way of making art, Rauschenberg thoroughly enjoyed the freedom to make everything up as he went along. Rauschenberg moved to New York in 1949 and took classes at the Art Students League. 3 years later, on a trip through Europe and North Africa, he made small collages and assemblages and exhibited them in Italy. So the small collages and assemblages, he's getting found pieces and putting those together to create a three-dimensional piece. So Albers taught on a strict, controlled approach to composition, but he inspired Rauschenberg to develop his own style. Postmodernist art combines and photo screens. Rauschenberg returned to New York in 1953 and began to experiment with cast-off materials that he found on the street. He dubbed his new works combines because they blended painting, drawing, photography, and various found objects, including a stuffed goat, a stuffed eagle, a quilt, clocks, and a pillow. In 1962, Rauschenberg's art took off in another direction. He began using a complex silk screening technique called photoscreen, incorporating published photographs into his paintings. He could resize the original images to the scale that he wanted and could make multiple copies to create a repetitive pattern. Rauschenberg used photos of common objects, buildings, well-known landmarks, current events, and people in the news. Pop artists such as Andy Warhol and Robert Rauschenberg created their pieces with a process called photoscreen printing. It allowed them to use photographs of people, landmarks, objects, and current events in their art. So starting with a mesh or a screen stretched on a frame, you coat the mesh on both sides with a light-sensitive emulsion while in the darkroom, so that's something you would use like in developing photographs. You would expose a photograph transparency on the mesh. You wash the mesh to break down the unexposed parts of it, and the exposed part remains and acts as it blocks ink from transferring to paper, canvas, or other surface during printing process. Print with a squeegee, pushing ink through the mesh onto the paper. So I think I read through all this. I should have showed you these pictures, so let's see. So this is where they coat the mesh on both sides with the light-sensitive emulsion. This is where they expose a photograph transparency on the mesh. This is where they're washing it. They wash the mesh to break down the unexposed part and to remove that. And now you've got the part where you're going to push the paint through that area. So the part that you see open, that's where the paint will actually go through. Everything else here is protected, so that when you push it through, then you see that on the other side. In Estate, which is the title of the artwork we see on the right, completed in 1963, Rauschenberg conveyed the energy and chaos of modern urban life. So that's life in the city. He silkscreened a photograph of a 1940s building multiple times throughout the painting. The most obvious image of the building is in the upper right-hand corner. Beneath it is a cornice from a 19th century building, providing the kind of visual contrast that is so much a part of life in modern cities. Rauschenberg seems to delight in such juxtapositions. He used these same two images in the center of the painting, cropping them and veiling them with thin white paint. So he's kind of hiding them a little bit with that white paint and angling them to emphasize the sense of jumbled energy. At the bottom of the painting, people stand by a tilted, out-of-scale Statue of Liberty, and an image of a clear water glass becomes repeating across the floor. So he liked to combine a number of techniques, and he was kind of portraying that energy and the different things going on in city life. So he did like to repeat his images, so we can see down here, this is the building that he started with. And there's the Statue of Liberty, so we see her down here. When you compare her to the building, she's much smaller, right? And here we see the water glasses on the floor. He liked to make references to the relationship between natural and urban worlds. And there on the left, There are 3 birds that seem to be suspended in space, each on its side. And in this section, we see a silkscreen image of the Sistine Chapel over one of his printed buildings, and then printed an image of a clock on top of them both. Inside the chapel, Michelangelo's painting, The Last Judgment, is visible on the wall, although the painting is partially hidden by the clock. The clock hands mysteriously mark the hour 8:20. Then there at the top, at the intersection of Pine Street, close to where Rauschenberg lived in New York, the signs tell the viewer to stop or go in 3 different directions. He liked to use energetic, uneven brushstrokes, reminiscent of abstract expressionism in the work of de Kooning. Rauschenberg organized the elements of this painting in a way that brought an underlying order to the chaos of his subject. Down here in the bottom left, we see a reference to the space program. And then in this section, he repeated a silkscreen photograph of the construction of the South Street elevated highway. He used black and white for one image, and he printed the other in color, and then brushed bold yellow paint strokes across. In the 1960s, Rauschenberg helped develop the pop art movement. The so-called pop artists found their subjects in the American popular culture. Colorful ads on billboards, magazine and newspaper photographs, and images on television inspired these pop artists. By choosing images for his paintings that people could recognize, such as a NASA rocket and the Statue of Liberty, Rauschenberg made his art accessible to and understandable by the general public. So in this picture here on the right, we see Robert Rauschenberg and Andy Warhol. They were the 2 leaders of the pop art movement, and here's a piece by Andy Warhol. So you can see he's using a celebrity of the time, which was Marilyn Monroe. He kind of posterizes the photographs, is what Warhol was known for. Christo and Jean-Claude, the environmental installation artists. Christo Vladimirov Zhakachev, universally identified by his first name alone, Christo, was born on June 13, 1935 in Bulgaria. From a young age, Christo showed talent as an artist. He entered art schools in Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia, but found the communist-imposed curriculum too limiting. In 1957, he hid away on a train to Austria and eventually settled in Paris. So when it says he stowed away, that means he hid. He didn't have a ticket. Broke, desperate, and alone in an unfamiliar city, Christo eked out a living by painting portraits, a job that he intensely disliked. He really did not like doing that. First, but still, there was one happy result. He met Moroccan-born Jean-Claude de Guillauban while painting her mother's portrait. Since 1962, Christo and Jean-Claude have been partners in art and marriage. In the 1960s, Christo and Jean-Claude became leading practitioners of a new kind of sculpture, environmental installation art. Their temporary, site-specific works have taken shape in a variety of urban and natural sites worldwide. So they've been in cities and in nature worldwide where they reach mass audiences. Early in his career, Christo became intertwined in wrapping objects in fabric to demonstrate how it can simultaneously conceal and define them. So how it could hide them and identify them all at the same time. He and Jean-Claude first collaborated in 1961 in Cologne, Germany, where they wrapped oil barrels and packages on a dock. Then they turned to other, more monumental projects, which included wrapping the Kunsthal Museum in Bern, Switzerland, the Pont Neuf Bridge in central Paris, and a set of small islands in Biscayne Bay near Miami, Florida. The magnitude and location of their works requires complex negotiations with landowners, community groups, and public officials. So they couldn't just go in and do this on their own. They did have to get permission and negotiate with these groups in these locations. Each project can take years of planning. Christo and Jean-Claude consider it all part of the creative process of their art. There is no admission charge. The costs are completely covered by the sale of Christo's preparatory drawings, sketches, models, and collages. So he could make his money off of what he needed to be prepared for these. So that is the bridge in Paris. This top one was the ancient wall in Rome, Italy. He also wrapped cars, and he wrapped Swiss trees in 1998. Central Park has been an important place for Christo and Jean-Claude ever since they immigrated to New York City in 1964. Impressed with the energetic flow of people walking through the city, they wanted to create an installation that would enhance that everyday experience for all who ventured into the park. They first proposed their project in 1979, but it wasn't finally approved until 2003. 2 years later, on February 12, 2005, the Gates Central Park, New York, created a luminous ribbon of color swirling through the park. So you can see that a little bit up here in the right. So the name of his work was The Gates Central Park, New York, 1979 to 2005. In all, there were some 7,500 gates, each 16 feet tall and of various widths, spanning some 23 miles of walkways in the park. After the gates were installed over a period of a few days, the saffron-colored fabric panels were unfurled to bloom throughout the park on the same day. When the gates were removed 16 days later, not a trace of the installation remained. So there, they're installing some of the framework. You can see this is a large process. And this is what they look like. The panels glowed in the sunlight, moved in the slightest breeze, and snapped in the wind, furling and unfurling just overhead. In the coldest month of the year, more than 1 million people strolled through the gates, snapping pictures and admiring the views. For a few days, even blasé New Yorkers acted like tourists in their own town, gawking at a familiar local landmark in an entirely new way. So New Yorkers may not always respond to things going on because they're used to there being so much activity, but what they're saying is that this really caught their eye and made them act like tourists in their own town. So here's another shot. We can see a carriage ride going through by the gates. You can see down here how they are higher and you can walk underneath them and how they would blow in the wind. That would be a striking image, wouldn't it? All right, so we have just finished this unit and I hope y'all have a great afternoon.